So I just want to, it's a huge welcome to you this evening. Welcome to the Understanding and Managing Trauma. We wanted to say up front, if you have any questions as this session goes on, we really encourage you to put them into the chat on the side, and we will definitely try and get to them at the end of the session if we can. We are really lucky to be joined by Cristina Garcia-Llavona. I got taught how to say her name earlier, and I hope I got that right. Cristina is a CBT and EMDR specialist who works with clients to help them process traumatic events. She was actually recently featured in a documentary on BBC. I'm going to put the link in the chat in case you fancy watching it, where she works with the war correspondent Fergal Keane, who you may have heard of, and talking about his experiences with PTSD after working in war zones. I can highly recommend that if you're interested in looking at someone's process of addressing their PTSD. So Christina's come along to talk to us a little bit about how trauma might present itself, particularly in relation to having cancer treatment, but also what we can do about it if we think we might need some help processing what we've been through. So I'm going to, Cristina, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. Thank you for the introduction. I think I'm going to start sharing my screen now, and hopefully that will work. Okay. Yes, I think it's working now, isn't it? Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you all for having me here. As Claire says, I often work with trauma. It's not the only thing I do in my work, but I spend a lot of time working with trauma, all sorts of trauma. We are going to talk a bit about what is a traumatic event. That's one of the things that we are going to cover today. So Claire has already introduced me, but, oh, 1 second now, sorry, cannot move the slides. 1 second, I may need to stop sharing for a moment.
Okay, no problem.
1 second.
Sometimes they get stuck on a glitch.
Let's see if maybe if I go to this one. And now I know what happened, I think. Okay, I think now it's changing the slide, is it? Yes. Is it? Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So there was a brief introduction about me, my background. I do cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and I also do EMDR, which is a very specific technique, which is often used with trauma. So these are the contents of what I want to cover today. I want to talk a bit about what is a traumatic event and what is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD for short. We are going to talk a bit about PTSD statistics, above all in relation to cancer, a couple of types of PTSD, symptoms of PTSD, other emotional states, other emotions that can coexist with PTSD. We are going to talk a bit about risk factors and then self-help tools, and also I'll tell you a bit about therapy approaches that are available. So first of all, let's start by talking about what is a traumatic event. It's very difficult to define a traumatic event, but I like this definition, which says that it's an event that shatters the person's core beliefs. It shatters the way we think about ourselves, about others, about the world, very often in a negative way, although maybe sometimes we can get some positiveness out of it as well. But it shatters, it breaks our core beliefs. One can develop PTSD after experiencing one or multiple traumatic events, but not only that, also by witnessing or by hearing or by reading about something traumatic. For instance, Claire was mentioning my work with Fergal Keane, war correspondent. So a war correspondent is not only that they put their lives at risk, but it's also everything they witness, they watch, and then they have to report on. So that is obviously very traumatic. So this is a list that I think it covers almost anything that we could consider traumatic. Could be accidents, could be natural disasters, it could be abuse, crime, physical abuse, bullying, domestic abuse, sexual assault, abuse or harassment, emotional abuse, race-based trauma, work-related exposure to trauma, for instance, people working on emergency services, journalism, army, etc., humanitarian organizations. Of course, trauma related to serious health problems. That's what matters to us today. Childbirth, war, armed conflict, terrorism, torture, imprisonment, human trafficking, suicide attempts. And remember, any of these can be experienced or witnessed. Okay, but the most important aspect of PTSD is how the individual interprets the event. So again, as a therapist, and in particular as a cognitive behavioral therapist, we look a lot into the meaning, the negative meaning that the person creates about the event. We'll talk about it. If you see these little stars I put here in the presentation, that means that I'm going to talk about it later. Okay, so we'll talk about meaning later. So again, what is post-traumatic stress disorder? The moment we talk about disorder means we are talking about mental illness. And maybe you know that there is this manual, the DSM, is a manual that is a classification of all the mental illnesses as they are considered today. And this classification is constantly reviewed. For instance, this last edition is from 2013. So according to the DSM, according to this manual, in order to make a diagnosis of PTSD, we need the traumatic event, but we also need that the symptoms persist after 1 month of the traumatic event. So here we have a bit of a problem already because, as you know, in cancer in particular, the event is ongoing. It doesn't end in few minutes or few hours or few days, unfortunately. So in this case, and in other examples of traumatic events, the event is ongoing. It hasn't ended yet. This is a very important point. Then we also consider diagnosis of PTSD when there is significant disruption in several areas of functioning. So the PTSD affects work or relationships, leisure, financial implications. So then we consider that this is becoming a disorder. And then remember, not everyone exposed to a traumatic event develops PTSD. I know the word trauma is used a bit loosely, including starting from myself or other professionals. So there is traumatic event, and then some people, not everybody, develops a traumatic reaction, post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's look at some statistics. I'm not going to bore you too much with that, but just for you to get an idea. In the general population, we can talk about more or less 4% of the population can have a diagnosis of PTSD at a given moment, okay? So it's about 30% of people who suffered a traumatic event develop the condition. So that means 70% of people don't, because they cope on their own and they heal and they recover. I always put this example. It's like if you cut your finger and you have a little cut, and it very often will heal. Sometimes it doesn't heal and it gets infected, and then we need to use antibiotics. But very often it heals on its own. So it will be a mistake to apply antibiotics before there is an infection. Okay. So look at cancer sufferers. A few statistics I found. So only about 3 or 4% of people show symptoms of PTSD immediately after diagnosis. There is a larger group of people between 22 or 55%, I know it's a bit loose, who show symptoms during or after treatment. And then there is about 80% of people who show some symptoms, but maybe not the whole diagnosis of PTSD. So super important, and something also I heard in some of the stories that I got to listen to these days in this conference, I heard some of you talking about your own story, and several people mentioned that they started suffering mentally even after remission, not immediately as soon as they got the diagnosis. And then what happens that by then people think you are fine, nobody's asking how you're feeling anymore. So it can be very isolating. And then it's when it's actually hitting you. So the appearance of PTSD symptoms very often is 6 months or more after diagnosis, and they can appear even after remission. Okay? Or if there are more episodes, can appear after one episode, in between episodes. Okay? Let's continue. So then another concept that we need to take into account is what is being called in literature, it's being called cancer-related post-traumatic stress without the word disorder. So that means we are normalizing. So about 80% of cancer patients, this is all coming from research, studies show these symptoms of PTS without the D. So it's like similar to PTSD, but with less intensity. And I think it's very important that, again, we don't pathologize. Like the example I give you of cutting your finger, it's very important that we don't apply medication before it's needed. So it's very important that we don't pathologize someone when the reaction might be within some kind of normal range. Okay, so I'm going to explain you what are the symptoms of PTSD disorder. And again, this is going to be a matter of intensity. So you might relate to some of the symptoms, but that doesn't mean you have full-blown PTSD. So basically, we are going to talk about 3 groups of symptoms, and they are all interacting. So on the first type of symptoms is what we call re-experiencing, which is how some moments, how memories and emotions keep coming back to our mind. Maybe some of you are familiar with the word flashback, and that's some of the ways that the person re-experiences the traumatic moments. And of course, this is unpleasant and this is painful. So very often then the person develops avoidance. So it becomes like a battle between the memories trying to come back, and the person pushes them away, and it's exhausting. And it's a never-ending battle. And then as a result, the person lives in a constant state of hyperarousal or hyper-alert or just anxiety. So remember, it's like these 2 things fighting there. Memories wanting to come in, and the person pushing them, avoiding, etc. So let me give you a little bit more detail into this. Let's start with the re-experiencing. So frequent upsetting thoughts or memories about a traumatic event. And I'll talk about it a bit more in a minute. Nightmares, very common to have nightmares about traumatic moments, the nightmares can be realistic. I mean, remember exactly what happened, or making things up. Dreams, well, dreams can be very bizarre. So the nightmares don't have to be necessarily exactly about what happened. Then the flashbacks is like the memories, but very vividly, acting or feeling like the event is happening again. So, flashback, obviously, that term, for instance, from movies, where suddenly in the movie they take us to the past, and which they show us a scene from the past in the story. So that's what a flashback is. It's like going back to that past moment and living it like if it's happening again. And then very strong waves of emotion. So suddenly there is this intrusive emotion, could be fear, but it could also be anger or shame or any of the other emotions that we are going to discuss. So this is what we call re-experiencing. It keeps coming back to you. Now let's talk a bit about the avoidance. So then, of course, as I said, because all that is very painful, and we don't want to feel the pain, then the person develops avoidance, avoiding the thoughts, avoiding feelings, avoiding conversations, avoiding any trigger. Anything can be a trigger. Anything can be a reminder. It could be anything. It could be the hospital, or it could be seeing something on television, or it could be a song because that song was played at a certain moment, or it can be a color, it can be the name of a person, it can be absolutely anything because our mind makes connections like that. So then the person might start avoiding those reminders, those triggers, dates, anniversaries, etc. Another way of avoidance that sometimes is a little bit done on purpose, but is that some people just somehow subconsciously or whatever you want to call it, they start forgetting some aspects of the traumatic event. So not only in cancer, but very often, I mean, some people forget important aspects, and that is somehow the mind not wanting to go there, wanting to suppress it. Then there could be avoidance of positive activities, losing the interest in hobbies or social activities, or then numbing activities. Someone might start about how he then developed a drinking problem, overeating or using drugs, or any other way of numbing the emotions and numbing the thoughts, not wanting to think, not wanting to feel. And then this is something that I'm very interested in, and it's going to sound like paradoxical to you. But then some people then start obsessively going on and on and on about it. So that's not avoidance, is it? Well, it is, because we are going to see in a minute how they obsess about things that did not happen. Therefore, they're avoiding what happened. I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. Okay? So the third group of symptoms, hyperarousal. Well, remember, PTSD, post-traumatic stress, is an anxiety disorder. That means the main emotion, not the only one, but the main is going to be fear. Because as we said before, there was an experience that was a threat, or we witness, or we watch it, or we hear about some kind of threat. So the main emotion is fight and flight response. Maybe you're a bit familiar with that term. So then other signs of hyperarousal, again, is the difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, irritability, poor concentration, feeling constantly on guard, being jumpy, that's very, very common, easily startled. So all of that are signs of being like really charged, in a constant state of alert. Okay. So you might be having questions. I wouldn't be surprised, but we decided that we'll have the questions and answers at the end. Okay, so then, as I said, let's talk a bit more about some of the things I just mentioned. So from listening to patients or people's stories, I think these are often, I mean, it's not an exclusive list. There could be things you could add to this list. But these are probably some of the most traumatic moments for somebody who suffers cancer. Very common, the moment of the diagnosis, or moments when they had to tell others, significant others, telling their partners, telling their children, telling friends, having to undergo tests, waiting for results that can be pretty traumatic. Of course, the treatment, of course, the side effects, the pain, surgeries, hospitalizations, hearing about other people dying. Someone was telling me the other day about, going to chemo and making like a little group there and getting to know other people. And then one day they don't come back. Some of them, they don't come back. They hear that they passed away. That can be really traumatic. Okay. So let's talk about memories. There is a difference between other memories, the way we remember anything else in our life, and then PTSD memories. So other memories, I mean, we don't remember absolutely everything, but very often other memories are a bit organized, above organized in time. For instance, if we remember our, I don't know, our 30th birthday, well, if you are like me, above 30, and then we can more or less put it in its place. Maybe we remember what we did and we remember the year. So usually it's organized in time. Often these memories have a beginning and an end. That doesn't mean that we remember every single detail, but more or less we can remember how it started, how it ended. It can feel distant in time. For instance, my 30th birthday feels really distant in time, but we can place it, you know, in time. It's long time ago, or it's very recent. It only happened a week ago. And then these memories can be intrusive. Suddenly we remember it, or they can be invited. It's like we go and we open a drawer and the memory is there. However, PTSD memories are not like that. First of all, are very chaotic, disorganized. I notice very often that people who suffer post-traumatic stress, they very often remember the beginning, but not the end of a traumatic moment. They are often fragmented, the memories scattered. They feel very present. Again, they don't place them in the past. It feels present. It's the reliving that we were talking about. And then very often these memories are not neutral. They come with a negative emotion, and they can be very intrusive, as we said before. Okay? So this is just a visual way of summarizing a bit what I just said. Imagine other memories being more or less classified, and we can go and retrieve that file. And PTSD memories often are a mess, disorganized, and we don't even know where to start to address them. So for instance, one of the things I do with my clients very often is to start putting the memories a bit in order. Above all, when the event is not one single event, when it has gone on for a long time, for instance, then we start putting things a bit in order and putting a bit of chronological order maybe, etc. So this is another way of understanding this. So imagine other memories. Some of you might be old enough like me to remember, for instance, an old photography film, you know? And here will be other memories, and we have the sequence of events, and we remember it more or less like that. But the traumatic memories are not like that. They are scattered, as we say. We forget. People forget a lot about what happened. So there are very few, but very vivid moments. And we call them hotspots. Okay? So these hotspots are scattered, fragmented, but super vivid moments, while other moments fade. Like here, then all these white here faded moments. So then there is something that most of my clients love, maybe because it's a bit rude. There is one particular hotspot, or it could be more than one, but often it's not many, that we call it, or I call it rudely, a oh shit moment. And some people, as soon as I say that, they immediately know what I mean. The oh shit moment is often one of the first few moments, not necessarily the first, but one of the first few moments. And it's the moment of, oh shit, what does that mean? Sorry for not being very eloquent, but it's the moment of where it hits you. And it's the moment when the person probably makes a prediction. And then that prediction happens or it doesn't. But the person gets stuck in that prediction. For instance, oh shit, I'm going to die. Oh shit, I'm going to be raped. Oh shit, something. It might happen, it might not happen. If the person, for instance, I'm going to die, if the person is in therapy, it isn't. So this oh shit moment is super, super important because it's getting stuck like in a time capsule. It's the only way I can explain it. And then very often, whatever happened after, it doesn't get processed. It's just being stuck in that prediction. So very often what happened after, it contradicts, no? Like, yeah, you were not killed. Still, the person feels stuck in that oh shit prediction. Okay, so let me put you another example of this. So again, a hotspot, we have a combination of three things. The memory, very detailed, very vivid, for instance, can be visual, but not only. It can be a smell, it can be a tactile sensation, it can be a sound, plus the negative emotion, plus the negative meaning, all of that together. Let me show you another example. Okay, so for instance, the moment of the diagnosis. Maybe some of you remember this moment really, really well. Maybe even if it was a long time ago. So imagine, for instance, that you have a picture, maybe you have the picture of the doctor in front of you or something like that, plus the emotion fear, plus the negative meaning, my life is over. So those three things come together. That's what we call the hotspot. And remember, maybe one or few of these hotspots is what we call the oh shit moments, because it's like being trapped on them, stuck. Okay? So that's more or less the way I can explain you the memories, the flashbacks, the traumatic memories. Let's go and talk a little bit about meanings, which, as I said before, is a super important part of the post-traumatic stress. So we all have core beliefs, all of us, about ourselves, about others, and about the world or life. So as we said at the beginning, a traumatic event is an event that shatters the main core beliefs of the person. So these are some examples of negative meanings that one person could think when having a post-traumatic reaction. For instance, negative beliefs about oneself. No? I'm alone, or this is my fault, I'm not coping right. Someone was mentioning in one of the talks that I listened to about, am I coping right? Am I doing the right thing? Maybe there is no right. But there is, it's common to develop some negative beliefs in a self-critical way, in being self-critical. I'm being punished, I don't have options, I don't have control, I will never recover, my life is over, I cannot make plans for the future. Someone was saying the other day in one of the talks something like, I have lost my freedom. I remember she said that, I lost my freedom, to be a negative meaning. Or negative meanings can be about others. Others don't understand. This is very common in PTSD. All my clients, regardless of the traumatic event, they always feel somehow disconnected with others. Others don't understand. Others don't care. Or if they care, they don't care the way I like them to care. Nobody will love me. I cannot trust others. So those are examples of negative beliefs about others. And then negative beliefs about the world or life. For instance, life is unfair. Well, this is a negative belief. Unfortunately, it's a bit true. Life is unfair. And we need to accept that. Or sometimes people have negative beliefs like bad things should only happen to bad people. Yeah, in an ideal world, but unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Or for instance, life is going on without me. So these are examples of negative beliefs about the world or life, unfairness, future, destiny, etc. Okay, let's move on a bit. Okay, so I said before that I was going to mention a little bit more about rumination, which is something I have been talking about avoidance, and now we are going to talk about obsessively thinking or even talking about it. But this is not a good thing either. So rumination is going on and on and on about something, brooding. Rumination is present in many other mental health problems. It's very common in anxiety, for instance, worry. Worry is an example of rumination, yes? Or there is rumination, which is typical in depression, okay? But there is also a typical rumination in post-traumatic stress. So rumination can be a form of avoidance. Again, they are the paradox, because very often it's thinking about things that did not happen. Therefore, we are not processing what actually happened. So, for instance, we could ruminate about better outcomes, better scenario. Very often it begins like something, if only. No, it's like, if only this, if only that, things will be better. So it's like fantasizing about things that did not happen, about better outcomes. But equally, the person can obsess about how things could have been worse. I could be dead by now. Or another way of ruminating in that way is the typical what ifs. What if I wouldn't have gone to the doctor? What if I would have done this? What if that? So scenarios that did not happen. That's why I insist this is another form of avoidance or denial, and it's not helpful. Why do we do this then? Because very often it gives us a false sense of control. When the truth is maybe we don't have control, or we didn't have control. For instance, if only I would have done this, then I wouldn't have this problem now. Maybe it was not in your control anyway. So very often this gives us a false sense of control, which again is not good for us, but it's some kind of quick relief, you know. So rumination is a theme that interests me a lot, not only in trauma. You might have met people that talk constantly about it. They need to talk about it. So we are going to talk about how talking is good, but when it's too much, then it becomes a problem, because again, it comes back with sorry, I was just distracted with reading something on the chat. It can be being stuckness, being stuck in something. It could also be related to other issues, for instance, anger. If there is resentment, if there is anger, the person could be stuck on that. Okay, so remember the rumination and the thinking about things that did not happen, or even talking about things that did not happen, that's a form of avoidance, and it's very common. Okay. Let's move on a bit. Okay, so other emotions. As I said before, the main emotion, one way or another, is going to be fear, sense of danger, sense of threat. But not only. We can find anger, for instance, we can find anger at life, at world, at God if one is religious, at others, or at self. Very often the person ends up being resentful of oneself. There could be feelings of shame, feeling exposed, it could be fear of criticism, it could be shame about us as a person, or it could be shame about appearance. Above all, in the case of cancer, of course, the body suffers a lot. You might be ashamed of the way you look. I was talking to someone the other day, and actually that's where she's a little bit stuck. And for instance, now, I mean, she's coping really, really, really well with everything, but there she's stuck. She's very ashamed of her body now. It affects her intimacy, her sexual life. It affects the way she chooses her clothes, and she's really stuck in the shame. Guilt. Another person the other day was telling me about guilt. It was her moment, it was her emotion. She feels very, very guilty because she feels she has been a burden for her husband. They were thinking of having children and then it couldn't be, and she feels extremely guilty about that. So in this case in particular, no anger, no shame, but for this person, it was the guilt. Or disgust. Being left with disgust, above all, you know, with some of the treatments that you might be going through, and being stuck, you know, with the smells, with taste, etc., and with the nausea, the sickness. So it could be leaving you with a constant sense of disgust, or very sensitive to disgust. Of course, symptoms of sadness. Sadness is related to a sense of loss and grief. It's not only that we grieve others, you know, that you might know, but also your losses. What are you grieving in your own life? What did you have to say goodbye to? Aspects of your life, things that you couldn't do and now you cannot do anymore, or at least not temporary. Feelings of loneliness, feelings of hopelessness, frustration. Frustration is what we feel when we fight, but nothing changes, so we get stuck. Okay? Okay, let me move forward a bit in case. So why some people develop PTSD and others don't? This is not a very easy question. Actually, there is not an answer. But I'm going to mention some factors that contribute. So particularly, I'm talking now about the cancer in particular. Some contributing factors will be about the illness itself. So for instance, depending on the state of cancer, the type of cancer, recurrence of cancer, how lengthy is the treatment, surgeries, hospitalizations, if there is lots of body parts. So if the cancer is very aggressive, obviously the chances of some PTSD symptoms are higher. Okay. And then some psychological factors. This applies also to clients who suffer other traumatic events. So for instance, if there is history of previous traumas, or if the person before the traumatic event was already living with a high level of stress, if there are problems in other areas of life, if there is also marital problems or financial problems, if there is lack of social support, if there is a threat to life and the body, if there are maladaptive coping habits, for instance, as we said before, drinking habits, etc., or depending on the relationship with the victim, for instance, in case of relatives or spouses, how close the relationship with the victim. So these factors contribute to the appearance of post-traumatic stress. And then some personality factors as well. So emotional avoidance, super important. Some people are very good at suppressing their emotions, and that can be useful sometimes, but very good at suppressing your emotions. If there is poor emotional expression, some people are very good at expressing themselves factually, logically, but not emotionally. So if you have poor emotional expression, if you tend to suppress your emotions, you could be a bit at risk of developing post-traumatic stress. Also, people who have a high need for control, for perfection, for certainty, safety, sense of justice or fairness, or for taking care of others. People who have high need for this could be, at risk of developing PTSD. Why the taking care of others? Well, because then when you suffer a traumatic event, you have to take care of yourself, you have to allow others to take care of yourself, and you have to be good at asking for help. So those factors, those personality factors, could put the person at risk of developing post-traumatic stress. Okay, let's move on. Okay, this is a very interesting concept, which is relatively new, and it's the concept of moral injury. What does this mean? So until now, we have been talking about life-threatening events or torture or abuse or things like that. But then some people get traumatized, if we can still use that word, by experiencing or witnessing events that go against own moral beliefs and values. So again, it's like a moral trauma, if we can call it like that, moral injury. It leaves the person with a sense of betrayal or neglect, and it could occur with cancer sufferers. For instance, if you think there was medical negligence, if you didn't feel support for others, or you didn't feel supported by social services, or you didn't feel supported by employers, and if there are legal battles, litigation, all of this could leave you feeling morally injured. And it's a very interesting concept. This is slightly new. It's not very well researched, but I notice it a lot in my clients with PTSD, regardless of what the traumatic event is. If there is litigation, believe me, there is never anybody, or very, very rarely to find someone who doesn't feel a bit traumatized by the litigation itself. Can be a very traumatic process, if we can use that word. Okay. Another super interesting concept, and I was very pleased to hear more or less about this in some of the stories, post-traumatic growth. So this is almost the opposite. It's like growing or developing a positive life change from a stressful, frightening experience. Many people, I have heard many people after an experience like this saying, I appreciate life, I appreciate the small moments, or the relationships I have, meaningful relationships, maybe less, but more meaningful, or they have come closer to some people. Some people might develop some kind of a spiritual change. Spiritual doesn't necessarily mean religious, maybe some kind of a different dimension, considering new possibilities or goals, feeling stronger, boosting their self-esteem, or even, like some people here, the sense of wanting to give back, wanting to help others, wanting to contribute, etc. So that will be what we consider post-traumatic growth. Okay, so let's move a bit more into, very quickly. When we talk about post-traumatic stress is not the only mental health problem that one can develop. There are other things that I'm not going to discuss. Unresolved grief, it could be other anxiety disorders, phobias, health anxiety, panic attacks, there could be depression. All of them could be secondary to PTSD, or they could coexist, but they're different. So one thing is PTSD, another thing is depression, another thing is panic attacks, etc. All right. So I bet you are all waiting for this, no? Like, yeah, okay, this is all very good, but what do I do? No, how do I cope? So these are some coping tools that I put there together that hopefully maybe you are already applying to yourselves, no? And if not, just to give you some ideas. So it's super important if you have trust in medical team. If you don't trust your doctors, then I suppose it will make things much more difficult. And then definitely support, and maybe that's probably the #1 reason why you are here with Shine. And it's about getting support from other people, could be friends and family, or it could be, organizations, it could be therapists, could be professionals. Emotional expression, as I said before, super, super, super important. Emotional expression is not only talking about emotions. It can be painting, it can be playing music, it can be anything creative. If you have any of these hobbies, then you know what I mean, because you express your emotions through art or in many other ways. Be creative. Having accurate information. Accurate means that you have to be careful, as you probably know, things like Googling too much. I mean, we all do it to a degree, but you have to be careful. Make sure that the information you get is precise, is accurate, and also there have to be times for that. It cannot be ongoing all the time checking. Support groups, ideally, for instance, here in Shine, I know you get offered that possibility. So finding a support group, it will be very helpful. Having a problem-solving attitude. I have heard this before, that many of you, when you get a diagnosis and when you have to go through treatment, you get into that problem-solving mode, a bit like automatic pilot. And that's why, as we said before, then if somebody develops PTSD, it's probably later, after the problem is more or less addressed, or at least for the time being. Okay, then learning to feel good about one's actions, working on your self-esteem, working on self-praise, gratitudes. I know you had a session on that. Assertiveness, super, super, super important. Learning to say no, learning to ask for help, meeting your own needs. So improving your assertiveness will be a good coping tool. And then good self-care habits. Let me talk a bit more about that. Okay, sorry, I'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, accepting own contradictions. So for instance, this will be part of the assertiveness. You can have good days, you can have bad days. You sometimes want people to take care of you, and sometimes you want people to treat you normally, like if nothing is happening. Or you want people to ask, and then sometimes you don't want people to ask. Or you want people to be kind to you, but they don't want to give you any special treatment. I heard someone the other day saying that they didn't like when people say, "Oh, you look well," or then we talk about the PTSD growth, but it could also be some PTSD symptoms. So remember, we'll find a lot of contradictions here. Okay. Some self-help, as I said, you probably want more of this. So healthy routine. We'll talk about what is a healthy routine, of course, adapted to some limitations you might have. Working on switching off the mind, working on mindfulness, meditation, good time management, even if you are very poorly, even if you are even bedbound or something, if you could have a little bit of a routine, doesn't matter how the smallest steps, but it's good to have a bit of routine, maybe anything that gives leisure, sleep hygiene. That's a concept that means good habits before sleep. Gratitude journals, I know you had a session on that. Working on self-praise and assertiveness skills. Let me give you a bit more on this. Daily routine. Okay, in theory, this is not just for you, but in theory, for anyone, each of us, we should be doing this every day. And I know it sounds like an awful lot, but it's doable because some activities fit into several of these categories. So ideally, one way or another, and when possible, I know some of you are limited, but we should have some physical activity and some mental activity. Mental activity can be work or it can be anything. It can be reading, it can be doing a crossword. We should also have some physical rest and some mental rest. Mental rest is when we give the mind a break. That's where we can do meditation or mindfulness or any activity that is creative and it doesn't make you think too much, you know, gardening, knitting, things like that. We all need some time alone, but we also need some time with others. And if it's not face-to-face with others, at least on the phone or video call or something. We need leisure every day. It doesn't matter how small. It could be watching TV. Someone was talking the other day about watching 400 episodes of Friends. Okay, if that's what you needed, that's what you needed. And then self-care, I mean, a minimum, if you can keep, you know, some hygiene and you can still keep a bit of taking care of your body, if you can do a little bit of pampering, anything that makes you feel good. So daily routine, very, very important. So I like this. It's very simple, but I think it's very easy to remember, like the ocean moments. 4 P's of mental health: people, planet, play, pray. I love it. It's very simple, and it's more or less what I just said, but in a simple manner. So people, contact with people. Choose. If there are some people that you don't want to have contact with now, then don't. Choose. Be selective, filter, but you need support from people. Let people in. Planet, whatever. It could be your dog. It could be the walking on the forest if you can. It could be looking at the trees from the window if that's all you can do. Play, leisure, whatever you can do, whatever is a bit of fun, or distraction, amusement, something a bit amusing. And then pray doesn't need to be in a religious manner. Again, it means maybe a moment of meditation, maybe a moment of getting in touch with your emotions, with your identity, who you are, where are we, with this moment in life, etc. So a bit of introspection. So remember that people, planet, play, pray. Okay, let me move. I think we are almost finishing. Okay, something again, very, very simple, but activities that make you feel better and activities that make you feel worse. So very simple examples. Maybe you eat a bit of ice cream, or you watch standards, or walking by the beach, listening to some disco music, clean bed sheets, or what makes me feel worse, news about the war, traffic jams, going to keep me alone, arguments with sister, horror movies. So you need to have your own list. And it should be small things like that. And then, of course, I would recommend you to do the things that make you feel better and avoid the things that make you feel worse, or at least reduce them if you can. Okay. So self-help resources. This is a very simple book on post-traumatic stress. It's not specific for cancers in general. And it's self-help means it has some exercises. It's very thin, very easy to read. And it's just called Overcoming Traumatic Stress. It gives you some exercises and maybe some activities that you can do, etc. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about treatment approaches. If you decide that you need therapy and if you have access to therapy, there are different approaches. The approach I do, but not the only one, is cognitive behavioral therapy. Maybe you have heard of it. And there is something similar, but not the same, called narrative exposure therapy. It's very much about going through the traumatic events and revisiting them. Some people also go into writing, involves writing. It can involve imagery, reliving the events, etc. Part of this, movement desensitization reprocessing. I know it's complicated, but it's a technique based on, it's not hypnosis, sounds like hypnosis, is not. It's based on the rapid eye movements that we do during the sleep, REM movements. I could explain a bit more about it if we have time. But if not, you can just go and Google it if you're curious. Then there is some supported trauma-focused computerized cognitive behavioral therapy, which means having therapy with a computer. Okay, why not? Okay, as a therapist myself, I think that could activate, you know, the human rapport. If that's all you have access to and it's out there, why not? Of course, group-based therapy, psychological debriefing. This is a bit controversial. So there are some studies that are a bit critical of psychological debriefing. Debriefing is considered to be some intervention, very early intervention. So intervention very soon after the traumatic event. And remember my example with cutting your finger. It's like sometimes could be applying antibiotics before there is an infection. So it could be a bit controversial. And then, of course, there is medication. You might need to have medication, to take antidepressants, or and it can help to manage some of the symptoms. Okay. Quickly, resilience. You might heard of that word. Some people don't even like the word, you know, like, oh, you have to be resilient. And say, what do you think I'm doing? Okay. So resilience is the capacity to recover from difficulties. It's about being a bit tough. Resilience is the ability to adapt to adversity. Resilience is about thriving, flourishing. And then there are some therapies focused on the concept of resilience. It includes, for instance, some assertiveness training. There is a therapy called ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, solution-focused therapy, compassion-focused therapy. That's very interesting. So just mentioning some words that you might find if you research a bit into therapy approaches. And then you will get a copy of this. You don't need to write it down. Free online resources. These are all web links that you can access, and there are exercises that you can use for relaxation, for gratitudes, support groups, ways to cope with trauma, resilience, assertiveness, sleep hygiene, mindfulness, etc. And I think that's it for me. Okay, I have a clock here. I was watching the clock all the time just to make sure that I was adjusting to the time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Cristina. It was so interesting. Gosh, we could have listened to you talk for hours, I'm sure. Shame we've only got an hour. We've got plenty of questions in the chat. I'm aware of time, so what I might do is stop the recording.
Shall I stop sharing?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay.
I think I'm going to stop the recording now, just so that the so I've